Welcome back to the College Essay Guy podcast. My name's Tom Campbell, and I'm College Essay Guy's community manager and a new co-host of the podcast. I like to joke that I'm not the college essay guy, but I am a college essay guy. Insert Dos Equis Man meme, probably something that only the millennials tuning in may remember. If you tuned in because you wanted Ethan to do a soothing, tranquil ASMR reading of Goodnight Moon to put you to sleep, you'll have to stay tuned because honestly, with all the stress of the college admission process, I actually think that episode has a lot of promise. Anywho, in a way, coming back to co-host this podcast is a little bit of a full circle moment for me because it was actually by doing a podcast with Ethan back when I worked at Pomona College that we first connected. Shameless plug for episode 302 and 303. Yeah, I didn't stop talking, so they made it into 2 episodes, which is just very on brand. And now Ethan and I work together full-time, trying to bring more ease, purpose, and joy to the college admission process, one YouTube video, podcast episode, and Barbie meme at a time. Check out our Instagram for more. But prior to working full-time at College Essay Guy, I worked for 2 years in admissions at my alma mater, College of the Holy Cross, go Satyrs, chased after the sunshine to work at Pomona College in Southern California for roughly 4 years, and momentarily embraced the rain while working as a college counselor at a selective independent school in Seattle. So during that time, read thousands of different applications, worked with many different students coming from lots of different high schools, and really try to bring that perspective and insight into the selective admissions world to our audience, right? On today's episode, I was honored to be joined by my wonderful colleague and friend, Susan Tree, our senior college counselor here at CEG, as we call it, where we unpack all things related to high school courses, how they influence a student's admission process, and what students and families should keep in mind, especially if they're in 9th and 10th grade, around choosing classes. Susan has spent 40 years working with young people and their families on both sides of the desk, as we call it, on all aspects of the college admission process. She started off her admission career at Bates College, where she helped pioneer the test optional movement well before the turning the tide in 2020. But for over 20 years after that, Susan served as the director of college counseling at a college prep day and boarding school near Philadelphia, where she worked with students from all over the world. These days, in addition to providing individualized college counseling to students and families through CEG, yes, we do a lot more than just essay support. Susan continues to read applications at selective liberal arts colleges and universities to, quote unquote, keep a finger on the pulse of what common themes, trends, and challenges are facing today's applicants. So she brings a whole wealth of knowledge, a whole wealth of experience, and a lot more insight into Star Wars than I was able to keep up with. So those parts of the podcast ended up getting cut. Now, the TLDR, or the too long didn't read, as the kids call it, theme of this episode is this. To be competitive at selective colleges and universities, students should take the equivalent of 4 years of what we call the 5 academic solids, or the 5 core subjects that are offered in most high schools: English, math, social studies, science, and a language course beyond English. And not just taking these subjects, but also embracing a healthy challenge of advanced coursework, whether those are advanced placement courses, international baccalaureate courses, or something more school-specific. But we also know from experience that this is an oversimplified piece of advice that doesn't take into account the everyday reality of moving through high school, right? Caps or limits around advanced coursework at your school, personal challenges you may have been going through, scheduling conflicts, a slam dunk teacher who happened to be on maternity leave, so a sub comes in and doesn't know the material as well as the students and they all take the class. The list goes on, right? So in this episode, we're going to dig into some of the more frequently asked questions we get around academics and how they're factored into the college admission conversation. So things like, how much do admissions officers really know about my high school? What's a school profile and how does that communicate the academic choices I had available to me at my school? How much do I need to explain about my academic journey in high school beyond my transcript? And how and where would I do that? What about AP and IB courses? Does it matter which ones I take, or do I just have to take any advanced classes to be competitive? What if my school doesn't have those courses? The list goes on. You'll leave with a much better sense of what admissions officers are asking themselves when they're reviewing your high school transcript and course choices, and some practical tips on what you can do to A, take courses that allow you to have the most college options as possible, and B, advocate for yourself beyond just sending in your transcript through the application process. And while this episode is more anchored around your high school courses, your transcript, and the admission officer perspective, stay tuned for part 2 in a few weeks, where we'll talk more about the term intellectual curiosity, what that means beyond just having A's in challenging courses, where admissions officers look for it, and how it can bring your college application to a whole new level. We hope you enjoy. Susan Tree, Senior College Counselor at College Essay Guy. Susan, how are you doing this beautiful Wednesday morning? in wherever you're tuning in from. I know where you are, but the audience may not.
I know, and our audience is all over the place, Tom. It's very exciting to think that we're speaking to, students, we're speaking to parents, we're speaking to college counselors, school counselors, and it's just such a pleasure to be here with you and unpack what I think is an extremely important subject, because it is a tremendous influence in the college admission process. But even more than that, it's a tremendous influence in the growing up of a generation of young people who have a lot of choices as they go into high school, into and through high school, and a lot of competing priorities as they think about who they are, what they love to study, what are the foundations that they need to be building, laying down in high school in order to be not only a strong college applicant, but well prepared for the challenges of a college education, whatever that looks like for you. I think we can instill in kids, especially by 10th grade, that the academic choices they're making in terms of their path are what are going to keep the doors open. That, so many high schools now, Tom, specialize to such a fare thee well. I'm just amazed. I read applications this year at my university from kids who were in marine science high schools on the coast of New Jersey.
I was just about to say New Jersey because I knew it's that school.
Oh, it's astounding how specialized schools can become. And I sometimes worry about kids coming, rising from 8th grade or rising from 9th grade that are going into highly specialized curriculum. And great, I'm really happy that there are a lot of options out there, but kids that age are such a work in progress. And in my mind, high school should be the full liberal arts experience, especially now that we know specialization at the college level has become so much more intense in the United States as opposed to, what it was decades ago. We've become almost more like Europe in some ways. We go into college thinking we know exactly what we're going to do, and it's going to be a professional degree, whether we're going for, a BFA or a nursing degree or an engineering degree. Even our computer scientists and our aerospace engineers need to understand how people think and how they reason. And look at what's happened with artificial intelligence just in a year. The people who are leading us forward into this new era of generative AI are people with broad literary, critical thinking skills. They understand how people think across all the disciplines. So important for us not to get kids in high school into a silo. And, to say to that rising junior who's stopping the foreign language or the social science to say, let's figure out how you can have your cake and eat it too, and keep those academic solids on your plate right up until the bitter end. Because as your mind matures, so will the range of your interests.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think if you plan your high school experience with this advice in mind, the doors that are open and available to you are so much more there. And in fact, I was actually just talking with a friend of mine who she knew early on in high school that she really wanted to go into fashion related courses and college fashion merchandising. And she kind of mapped out and she was like, hey, I saw my graduation requirements for my high school in Maine, and I didn't need to take, more than 2 years of these science courses, which I really didn't enjoy, and they're not related to what I want to do. So I just did the graduation requirements and looked at programs that only needed those years. And then she said, but on the flip side, there were certain schools that I stumbled upon, and there was actually a school that I was really, really interested in that I applied to, Marist College.
Yeah,
that had a program that I was really excited about, and also just an amazing location and great school. But because I didn't have really the courses that they even were asking for on their for their requirements, I was really kind of not competitive right from the beginning.
Wow.
All that to say, I think it's great to, as a high school student, kind of know what you want to do. And if you're in that position and you're like, I've known since I was 3 years old that I want to be an astronaut, right? You can map out your courses accordingly. But I think the reason why I think that speaking from the lens of more selective schools and the courses that generally they prefer is helpful to anyone who's tuning in, no matter if that's your path or not, is doors will be more available and open to you if you kind of keep these pieces of advice in mind throughout high school. And I would argue too that because these colleges are valuing these core academic courses, there's a lot to be gained from taking them in terms of your own growth and development.
Absolutely.
your critical thinking skills, your ability to craft an argument and present that through your history and your English classes, and to be analytical and dig through data, through your science courses, right? So you have a lot to gain from these courses that we're about to mention, but we know that you're all individuals as well. So
yeah, and I would dare say that the student who grows up wanting to be a fashion designer ought to know a lot about science and ought to know a foreign language and ought to know a lot about history and sociology. So many students want to know, what do I have to take in my high school curriculum to get in? Well, what colleges resort to usually is saying, we expect you to have taken the basics, like across the 5 academic disciplines. We expect you to have taken, obviously, whatever your high school requires you to take for graduation. Beyond that, though, are the recommendations. And if you look at the common data set in the C section, and friends, if you don't know what the common data set is it's just simply a standardized form on most, I would say 95% of the colleges and universities publish it on their website in this standardized form, but it's not in the admissions part of the website. It's usually in institutional research.
Yeah.
You go to the C section. What they'll do in the C section is give you a chart of required high school coursework and recommended high school coursework. The college's own website will often give this to you as well, but with an explanation. So use the common data set for maybe a quick look, but then definitely go to the college's website, look for academic requirements, and you'll get a little bit more of a description. Because remember, if you're applying to a university that is evaluating you for engineering or for business or for potentially the liberal arts, for nursing, for applied science, you should look a little deeper because, 3 years of math is probably not going to cut it for those STEM fields, including nursing, right? And 2 years of foreign language is not going to cut it for communications and journalism or international relations. So be careful about what you kind of take at face value, but know that the more competitive the university, the more coursework and the higher level of coursework they are going to look for on that high school transcript, particularly the alignment with what you've taken in high school and what you then are expressing as your area of academic interest, or in some cases, when you're applying directly to a major. But even the required and recommended number of courses at the very selective colleges, you will have applicants who go way beyond. They will have 6 years. They'll be in, not always, but if they're looking at a STEM field and they took their second year of calculus in 10th or 11th grade, I kid you not, then you have to find out a way to take multivariable calculus or linear algebra or number theory. And if your school doesn't offer it, because a lot don't, then you check out the local community college, you check out what you can do online, you check out Coursera, MIT, MOOCs, massive online free classes. There are ways, no matter where you go to high school, where you can create opportunities for yourself to keep moving forward. Your high school doesn't offer a poetry class. Someone does. Your guidance counselor doesn't have any great ideas. Does your English teacher have some ideas? There are ways. You see Scout, Yale, open courseware, but it can show, wow, there wasn't a way to do this, but I found a way to make it happen, even if I'm not getting credit for it. Maybe it'll never be on a transcript. Maybe it will, but how wonderful to show that level of interest.
Yeah. And self-directedness, I talk about that a lot in the highly selective courses, is how valuable that can be to see and have that be demonstrated somewhere in a student's file. And I love that you said, I'm not getting credit for this, because there's such that link and association with well, if it's not creditable, it's not worthwhile or it's not worth including. And something else that you touched on just now is kind of the variance of, for example, if you're interested in certain selective STEM programs and you go to a competitive high school where a lot of kids are also looking at those programs in schools and there are a lot of courses available, I think it really kind of starts to introduce the part of the podcast, which is about school context.
Yes.
And, a lot of times a big question that I'll get from students and families is, but what about my school? Like, does people in admissions really know how hard it is? Or do they know that, my 4.0 at, Lakeshore Drive Academy is way harder than Roscoe Village School, those 4.5. These are just the neighborhoods near me in Chicago where I'm staying. Every corner is a source of inspiration. But yeah, it really is, I think, an understandable question is like, how do people in admissions, like, how are they going to judge me or compare me to other people who are also applying, both from my school and around that? I think for families, if you're curious about the way that your high school is viewed by admissions offices, the very first thing that I would say that you should do is look up the school profile for your high school. Oftentimes, I've actually found out that people surprisingly are not aware that this exists. These documents are typically available, to students and families and the public in general, right? So an admissions officer who maybe is looking for more information might look up some of those data points on a school's website. And usually what it includes is information just about the courses that are available in the high school. So what type of curriculum is there? Is it advanced placement, AP curriculum, IB, International Baccalaureate Diploma? Is it the school's own unique advanced or accelerated pathway that they may have that they've designed themselves, which is great. It's great when you're at a school where the teachers have influenced the curriculum and maybe it deviates a little bit from some of these more standardized curriculum sets that are out there. No matter kind of what is out there, the point or the real goal of the admissions officer is not to judge what your school is offering you. It's not to make value judgments on you that, you went to a school that has an AP curriculum, so you might be this type of kid. That right. is not a part of the conversation. What they really want to know is I am tasked, it's my job, as an admissions officer to evaluate students from this high school. I need to know that I'm presenting this file, what was available for them, and what did they leave on the table? And that's a big question that people in selective admissions offices are going to be asking themselves related to your academic record, right? There also might include information around what % of students go on to four-year colleges.
Right.
Often that's
Very
used
important.
as a really critical data point for admissions officers in getting a sense for example, a student who's going from a school where 99% or 100% of students are going on to four-year colleges, they may be more comfortable admitting a student who has a few more A minuses, maybe a few more Bs, a little, quote unquote softness academically, than say a student who is going to a school where only 20% of students go on to four-year colleges. There's a little more of a pressure on students there or a little bit of weariness around admitting students who are not quite at that top level at that type of high school, only because there will be concerns about the student's ability to be successful on the college level at that selective, rigorous college, right? So all of that information is going to vary from high school to high school, but it is all valuable and helpful to people in admissions in making those decisions. So my advice for students and families is usually first to be aware of what's being sent out there to colleges. And, as a parent or guardian, if you have any follow-up questions or are curious about why maybe certain pieces of information are included and not others, this is not saying that everyone should be spamming the inboxes of their school counseling offices for minute distinctions. But if you do have any genuine concerns or like, hey, my student's taking this class in this particular special program, at the high school, and I'm not seeing a paragraph or a section explaining what that is, that might be something that I imagine people in admissions would really want to know. It's definitely worthwhile to, advocate for your child and to make sure that the high school experience that your child has had is being reflected somewhere, or there's information about what pathway they were able to take on that particular document, right?
Every family needs to sit down with a copy of the school profile and their child's transcript. Just as if they were an admissions officer looking at that transcript and trying to understand what was available to the student and what had the student taken advantage of. I met with a junior a week or two ago, Massachusetts, who high-end mathematician, and I was curious to know what he was planning for classes for his senior year. I looked at the school profile, which I found on the website of the high school, and I saw, oh, here are the courses that are available to him. So when I talked with him and asked what he was taking, I said, well, what are you taking for math next year? And he said, well, I've maxed out the curriculum and I'm not sure really what to do. And I said, well, on the profile, it says that your school offers whatever it was, a second year of calculus or something. He goes, oh, that hasn't been offered for years. And I thought, well, that was a classic example of a weirdness that would have been noticed by the college. And while they wouldn't have known how to interpret that then, or the case of the student where they couldn't take Mandarin 3 because the program had been eliminated, but it was still on the profile. So I said to the student, I said, okay, here's what you need to ask your counselor. Is this profile going to be different next year to show? And he said, well, maybe sometimes it's like an every other year class. And I said, well, find out who's explaining that. When you apply, find out what the counselor is going to be saying, what the profile is going to be saying, what the counselor may be saying in the school report form. And you may need to take responsibility for explaining this. The common application gives you an additional information section, and it's a wildcard section. You can use it to add information, add context, explain weird things. So that's really important. A lot of high schools, and this now I'm speaking from the standpoint of an application reader, a lot of high schools, when you read transcripts, it's combat. And it's almost like there's this minefield of information and lack of information that as an admissions reader, you have to work your way through in order to get a fair assessment of the student. Some of this are states in this fine nation of ours that have never figured out how to present high school credentials in the college admission process.
Florida, if you're listening, you have a lot of critiques from admissions officers with the way the transcripts are printed out.
OMG.
Yeah, it's a labyrinth for sure.
And again, I think if a parent requests the transcript exactly, not report cards, but a copy of the transcript as it will be shared with the colleges. And a lot of kids and parents don't realize that those are two different things, right? That the report cards you get at home are not what go to the colleges. The high school transcript is a different document.
Right.
So your report card may show grades for every quarter. It may show absences, tardies, and other extraneous information that probably aren't going to be shared with the colleges.
Right.
And the transcript may only show end of year grades, or it may show just semester grades.
Yeah. And I think that can be for some students, it can actually be very liberating in a way, actually, to see like, oh, gee, it's just a semester course. Gee, that time that I got that B- in calc first quarter, but then I brought it up back to, an A- second quarter, all they're seeing is that B+ or so, right? Like sometimes I don't think students and families know that until it's kind of, they've spent so much time and years of high school, sometimes even fretting about each individual report card and grade report. And I think the sooner you can realize what colleges have access to and what your school is sending in on your behalf, I think that can actually help to be strategic as a high school student and know, hey, if I had a dip, this quarter, I know that maybe next quarter, if I'm looking at these types of schools, that getting it up to a certain point is really going to be my goal in terms of having a grade that I feel will keep me in the running at some of these colleges that I'm interested in. And it can really kind of take away that kind of, and it's something that I noticed working at a high school. And I think back to my own self and I like pinch myself for being like, why were you so hyperfixated on each individual assignment? But working at a high school, I remember like you could tell the 9th grade tables oftentimes because all they were doing was talking about like quizzes and grades and this and that. And, I was at a high school where, it was a very high achieving population and you had to apply to attend the school and you were a star in your middle school perhaps, right? And I think that's kind of, sometimes if you're a student who's listening and you do attend a school like that, sometimes it's all you know. And it's all you've kind of been known. It's one of the biggest things that you've been known for is kind of that star academician, that star academic student. And to be in an environment where there are a lot of other stars, from their previous school can be, it's the same thing at college. There's a lot of talk about imposter syndrome and
Yes.
I know that's, again, podcast for another day, but all that to say, I do think being aware of what's being communicated, you know, and how it's being communicated about your academic experience is a really crucial question to be thinking about sooner than later. Not so that you can be so stressed out and have it be like the laser focused goal of like, I need to make sure it looks a certain way when it's being submitted, because life is not often that predictable as we've seen pandemic, right? There are things that come around that none of us could have predicted. But I do think that awareness can actually be a blessing rather than a hindrance, because it oftentimes puts into perspective how that localized view of your high school experience is not the admissions officer's reality.
That's right.
They do not know that week, March of 2023, you have bombed this midterm because so-and-so, you know, was stranded at the parking lot. You had to pick her up and you weren't able to study. They will never know about that particular, you know, smidge instance in your existence and the existence of the entire human history. And I think kind of just knowing that you don't have basically like all eyes on you at every single second of your life can be a breath, an ease moment, you know, since we're all about ease, purpose, and joy at college.
That's right. And it eliminates some of the fear of the unknown when you kind of know how things. So I think an important thing is when you look at your own transcript, say at the end of your junior year, you can say to yourself, okay, I can understand now that, you know, when I had mono in 10th grade, it doesn't show that what I was worried about isn't showing up, or it is. Or the fact that my teacher left in the middle of the semester on maternity leave and we didn't actually have a teacher for a period of time. And it helps to be able to talk to your guidance counselor or your school counselor, whoever's going to be writing your letter on behalf of the school, and say, who's explaining this? Is this something, you know, it seems like it's more something the school should explain. Now, if there's been a change in counselor, someone needs to know what you think would be helpful for them to include in it as they represent your record. You know, what students often don't realize is that when a college sits down and is evaluating their application and they're looking at the transcript, they're really looking at a historical document that has a lot of context to it. So they're looking at grades 9 through, at least through the end of 11th grade and possibly partway through 12th grade, depending on the time of the year. And they're looking at a student with particular academic interests and particular strengths. So the question of AP or this class or that class is not looked at in a vacuum. It's looked at as part of kind of a historical journey that a student has taken through their high school experience. The context in which that is read is what is available at the school and how they manage the curriculum and the curriculum choices that kids have to make from year to year. Some high schools, if you don't join the pre-AP program, which could be in middle school, actually, 7th or 8th grade, but at least in 9th grade, you don't get to be in the AP track. It's viewed as a track as opposed to options for different classes. A lot of high schools offer some APs, if they offer any at all. And there are plenty of high schools in the country that do not use the AP curriculum. Some high schools believe that offering like all, I think it's 36 AP subjects. You can fact check that for me, Tom. Some are semester in length, some are year-long classes. They equate the number of APs with the prestige of their high school, and they view it as a selling point. Real estate agents use it as a selling point. They believe colleges are really impressed by this. And truthfully, colleges don't judge high schools that way. They really don't. They don't look at standard measures like that. They'll look and see what the nature of the curriculum is that's being offered. And then they'll look at you as an applicant and say, well, what did the student take advantage of? So there's a lot of work that the colleges have to do. They have to slow down, study what the high school is all about, and really work at unpacking the student's transcript. But students need to help. They need to make sure the school is representing them well. And also they have to tell their own story as to their learning style, what is the academic platform on which their high school curriculum has been built, and why does it represent for them an excellent preparation for whatever it is they are hoping to study in college.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think schools make decisions based on what's best for their communities. And I think so frequently I've worked with students and families who have been really concerned about the perception of the courses at their school. I think that's kind of where collaboration between students, families, and the counselor in the high school, like if you are encountering it and especially if you have the chance, which it can be difficult, to be able to have, especially increasingly so, maybe phone calls or communications via email with individual admissions officers, but just getting a sense for kind of how they are viewing different parts of your curriculum. Because I've been to many schools where there is a disconnect between the applicants that were being sent to me and how many advanced placement classes that were there and what the students took. And it seemed surprisingly light, especially because there'd be one or two kids who did have that higher number of advanced placement courses that I was saying, okay, well, if there are a small handful of kids doing this, obviously you're able to do it. There's not curriculum limits that are being mentioned in the school program.
Right.
I would take the time to get to learn that, but I do think making sure that your school profile is as clear and captures the reality of like what these courses actually mean, what they do, what they have capacity for, the level of them is something that however you can communicate that message. So this is definitely a tip for counselors here.
Yes.
Definitely investing time in a easy to read school profile that really breaks down the levels essentially of these classes.
Right.
And, I understand that there's lots of nuance between individual teachers that offer it. And of course, like in a given year, sometimes there might be a teacher who's on paternity or maternity leave or is the only person who was teaching the class, so it wasn't offered that year. Making sure I've seen schools, for example, put like red bolded text on the top of a school profile in a certain year that it's being sent out to be like, hey, critical updates for the 2023 application cycle, like this class is not being offered for XYZ reasons. Those extenuating circumstances are definitely, it's great when students can mention that in their own words, but kind of having there be something that's written in a profile that way all your students can benefit from it.
Right.
In the case that they don't, put that little blurb in their additional information section in their common application, at least it's there for an admissions officer to see and notice clearly based on those, just like those visual distinctive features, whether it's highlighted, bolded, red, ink, whatever it may be, just any of those kind of particularities, mentioning those. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, when it comes to if you are a high school student who does have an AP curriculum available to you, I do think being aware that colleges will be looking at the number of classes that your school says that they offer. And if there are certain barriers, like what Susan had just mentioned around, you have to be tracked for certain classes, there may have been things that happen when a lot of students, may, for example, like transfer high schools, and maybe sometimes that might impact their ability to track into certain advanced classes in that new school.
Right.
Really just making sure that the admissions officer is not going to know that full backstory if you do not communicate it or mention to your counselor, hey, this is something that I really want to make sure colleges know about my experience related to having access to this. So I just think that more information when it comes to essentially any of these kind of like, oh, I wonder why they didn't take insert course, if there's a reason as to why, including that in your rationale and in your application somewhere. It doesn't have to be everywhere, but somewhere is definitely, I'd say, a great rule of thumb.
Absolutely.
And then in terms of, just getting really pragmatic with the AP curriculum and just recommending specific courses, is going to be those core solid academic areas.
That's right.
Sciences, right? Physics, biology, chemistry. At many selective schools, there will be an expectation that you've taken those courses. And what level they are at depends on what your school offers. But if you are in a school that has AP, all three of those classes, and you're wondering, hey, will I still be competitive at insert highly rejected school? Let's use Chicago right now, just for the sake of variety, right? If I take AP environmental science instead of chemistry, for example, like, will that impact my chances? And the answer, to be very frank, is yes, right? That's a school where the level of selectivity for students is going to allow them to choose the students who have taken the most challenging classes in those core solid academic areas, even if the student's not necessarily doesn't necessarily identify as a STEM student.
Right.
I'm pursuing a STEM major, right? So I think, in kind of asking how will colleges view XYZ courses, in general, the fact that you're taking advanced placement classes at all is showing a level of investment in your education beyond.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is great. And that's something that colleges across the spectrum, regardless of their selectivity, will recognize that and factor that into their assessment. I do think kind of like one of my biggest insights that I kind of learned from my own experience, like applying to college and thinking about what was available at Cathedral High School in Springfield, Mass, and then working at admissions at Holy Cross and Pomona, I, for example, opted for a class in my high school had advanced placement physics, chemistry, and biology. And science was never really necessarily my huge forte. And I didn't really want to pursue that in college. It wasn't my goal, but I knew I wanted to take advanced sciences, because I wanted to be competitive for more selective schools. And in my eyes, and in talking with my counselor, I was kind of under the impression that taking honors biology 2, I had already taken honors biology 1, the 9th grader, and honors biology 2 was a super cool, very unique class offered by my high school. It was an aquaculture class.
Wow.
Super unusual, right? So we actually had a fish tank in the classroom and we grew the fish. We learned all about kind of the processes behind running a fish farm, the biology behind fish. Every lesson was so niche and interesting, and you learned a lot out of it. It was a lot more project-based than the original honors biology 1, which was very traditional, introductory, advanced science class for students just starting out of high school, right? But the teacher who taught this, it was so clear. Mr. Broder, shout out to Mr. Broder. He really invested in putting this class together that was so unique. There's so many great takeaways from it. Of course, I just turned 31 this past week, and I can't exactly tell you all the intricacies of the fish biological reality, but we did actually end up eating the fish in the end. We cooked them in the school cafeteria. They were catfish. So we had a nice little Cajun celebratory, which people are like, that's kind of morbid. You grew these fish in class and then ended up eating them in the end. And I'm like, hey, circle of life. That's what biology is all about, right? So anyway, from this, little swimming up course from what we're talking about, I thought, because this class was so unique and cool and so hands-on, that colleges would really easily understand that and recognize, this cool academic path that I had chosen to take. But what I neglected to realize was that the way that the course was not necessarily given as much airtime as I thought admissions officers had the time or energy or ability to dive into. Another
bad pun.
Well, no, I was going to say, unintentionally, yes, very bad, but that was actually kind of that just rolled right off the tongue. But I didn't realize that, honestly, I probably would have been more competitive at a wider range of schools because my school offered AP biology. I had a lot of classmates who took it. The aquaculture class to me was more interesting for all the reasons I mentioned, but I didn't put the pieces together that someone on the other end, all these admissions officers who, are reading for lots of different high schools in a region, they're being given information provided by the high school about what these classes are, and they're given certain levels of rigor. Honors is listed below AP in terms of, the level, right?
The hierarchy, right?
Hierarchy, right? So I think that is just something to be aware of, that unless there is some explicit mentioning of these levels, and there is going to be, in terms of making this workflow efficient and kind of to make it digestible for admissions officers to get to know every high school, it really is the way that information is presented that is the way they're going to be making these decisions. So if I was to turn back the clock, I probably would have disclosed a little more information about taking this aquaculture class and why I chose it. And I feel like if an admissions reader saw that small kind of explanation in my additional info section, that inevitable question that they may have received from a colleague, well, why didn't he take AP Bio? It's available at the high school. That admissions officer would have had a rationale from me to show that.
Defend
yeah. And especially for grounding it in, you were curious about the class, you thought it looked really neat, then this is what you got out of it. Who is to say how much that short explanation will tip the needle in terms of someone really understanding the scope of what you have taken a part of? But it's worth it to invest in actually doing it than not, because you have nothing to lose and everything to gain by mentioning your intentional decisions behind your course.
Absolutely.
So I think that's like a really big takeaway, regardless of if you're in an AP school, IB school, whatnot. Yes, you probably are wondering, is someone going to see AP environmental science with the same weight as AP chemistry? The rule of thumb is probably not, right? It doesn't mean you shouldn't take AP environmental science. It's a great class, especially right now. It's so timely. So many students are interested in how we can better address climate change. It's a great way to be able to learn the foundations of what's happening to the planet and what has happened over thousands and thousands of years of evolution, right? So taking the class has a lot of benefits for it beyond just being competitive for colleges. And yes, because it is an advanced placement class, that still will be seen as an elevated level of investment beyond the standard classes your school offers. But it's just kind of understanding, again, that the default of the core solid academic courses, there's going to be areas where that's not as...
It's not as weighty.
Not as defined, right? So for example, the history and social studies offerings for advanced placement classes are not going to necessarily be like, oh, you should definitely take AP World instead of AP US because it's more expansive. Sure, that is true because World History is going to cover more options, but in admissions, it's not going to be seen, for example, as a decision between an environmental science class, which is not considered a core solid science classes. There's a little more nuance, I'd say, with some of the other subjects. With
I agree.
Studies with, for example, language. No one in admissions is going to be like, well, the school offered Mandarin, they offered Japanese, they offered German, they offered Spanish, and the student took Spanish. They could have taken something more creative. That's not a real scenario that happens, right? So it can be hard to kind of like understand how someone on the other end is going to evaluate those decisions. But in general, I would say, if your school offers both AP language and AP literature, I would recommend taking both of those, right? If you want to be competitive for selective colleges, even if you're like, oh, I'm a STEM kid, right? I'm not as interested in English. If your school offers those two classes and you want to be competitive for schools with, I'd say less than like a 30% acceptance rate, that's a very generalized recommendation. But generally, they're going to see those two classes offered and wonder why you didn't take insert class, right?
Interestingly, more and more schools in the US, especially pretty high-end schools, mostly private, some public, have laid down the advanced placement curriculum in their school. This was a tidal wave on the East Coast from Washington, D.C. to New York, that independent schools, within a period of a couple of years, brought forward what is now known as the independent curriculum, an independent curriculum that is designed by the faculty so students can go farther in their academic disciplines beyond AP. And those were kids who, in some cases, were being changed by the AP curriculum.
Right.
And if their parents were paying to send them to an independent school, it wasn't right. So DC, Philadelphia, New York, suddenly there are a lot of independent schools that have independent curriculum. And the high schools, including the one that I worked at for many years, now have enough history to know that, if anything, their students were advantaged in the college admission process as opposed to disadvantaged, which was an original thought. But it takes a little studying on the part of the admissions reader to look at the profile and make sure they see what the school offers and what the students are taking who are at the very top of the rigor ladder, so to speak, because that often carries the day in an application evaluation at a very competitive university.
Yeah.
And IB, Tom, as a reader, when I read an IB student, I first look to see if they're a diploma candidate because they aren't all diploma candidates.
Right.
Some students are taking a hybrid model of AP and IB. Mm-hmm. And you just want to, as a reader of that application, you want to see, well, what does that mean? Why aren't they an IB diploma candidate? Right. Did this hybrid model give them access to a broader, range of courses, more rigor, perhaps?
Yeah.
That was appropriate. So there's not an automatic judgment, but you do, as an evaluator, have to figure that out.
Right.
And if a student is a diploma candidate, then you need to look at what the higher levels are. There are 3 of those. once in a blue moon 4, but you never expect to see 4, right? It's kind of breaking a lot of rules for a student to take 4 higher levels. But those higher levels are a 2-year sequence, right? And then in the fall, at the end of junior year, there will be predicted IB scores, which can make a big splash at highly selective. If someone's crossing that 40 barrier, that 40 threshold, that's something that the most selective colleges in the U.S. will immediately notice. That's top of the scale. And then they will get is it October of senior year or the equivalent of senior year, we'll get IB scores. And my timing may be off a little bit there. Some schools, pandemic interrupted so much there. But the choice of your higher levels is an interesting one because IB curriculum has diversified a fair amount in the last years. And, you can do higher level now in business, in film, in areas that were not considered necessarily to be the courses of highest rigor. But they're being taught at the higher level and the students getting an IB diploma, more power to them. It's just like with AP, the students should be taking advantage of the most rigor that they can get in the areas they're most interested in and most likely to be saying they're going to be studying.
Yeah.
So, if you're thinking about studying physics or engineering, you should be looking for the highest level of rigor in math and science.
Right. That it's funny. I used to joke that when I saw an IB school and it was a diploma candidate, I would be like, oh, this is an easy one. Because you don't have to really do too much looking and comparing to, okay, which level of math did a student take a junior year or, what was available from, based on the AP load at the school. Because there's a lot more variance, right, of AP distributions depending on the individual high school and what teaching staff that they have available to teach those courses. I think that, for students who are coming from an IB school, I think do know that people in admissions really see the value of that curriculum. There's a lot of, I think, great skills that you're developing that really translate easily to college, especially with your theory of knowledge course, with your extended essay. And actually, I highly encourage IB students to even mention briefly in their additional information section what that project was. You spent so much time working on it, and it is a small snapshot of the journey you're about to embark on the college level with in-depth research and really kind of driving a project forward and having it be driven by your own curiosity and interest. So I definitely think that if you're at an IB school, that's great. And I think one thing I always, with any of these kind of points of when I shout out certain schools or certain curriculum, I always think about the kid who's listening, who's like, but I don't go to that school. Does that mean that I'm lesser or I'm not going to be seen as college ready? And I always catch myself in those moments to kind of put it out that disclaimer that anytime where I'm highlighting or propping up a certain course option, it's not me saying this is the ranking for one Tom Campbell, who's one admissions officer out of many, of all the different types of rigor that's available. It's not my job, again, to judge, or it's not my job to be everyone should be transferring to this type of school because it's the easiest to read on a transcript and you gain a lot of great skills, right? So I think if you're a student who's listening and, any of the pieces of advice that we're giving or situations that we're putting out there, types of schools, really do know that that person who's on the other end is not there to judge your high school. They're not evaluating your school. They're evaluating you, and they're evaluating what you're able to contribute to their community. And everyone, no matter what your educational background is, has something to contribute to these college campuses. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be admitted to all of your top choices or even, some of the schools that as you go through this college journey, you may be surprised that you're like, oh, I thought that was a target. And then maybe you'll learn from your college counselor that maybe it's more of a reach. It's not to say that, there's no value judgments that are coming along with your school. People in admissions have seen it all, right? We've talked about schools that we have seen that have narrative evaluations and ones that have trimesters and semesters. We're really big at College Essay Guy about controlling what you can control.
That's right.
And we hope that the information that we're providing around different course options of rigor and advanced courses are helpful context for you to know kind of what's out there and how situational it will be for someone in admissions to evaluate you, and how it will be a completely different lens than when they're evaluating even the students from the school down the street from you. So hopefully that provides a little more relief than stress because, there's thousands of different ways to quote unquote do school, right? And all those students are a part of these college communities because, as you mentioned, Susan, right? Everyone's bringing something different. Everyone's bringing a different perspective. They've been in different learning environments, and that's going to influence what they contribute to discussions and work on the college level. Research, groups and labs. There's so many studies that kind of have demonstrated how that variety allows problem solving to be so much more accurate and dynamic and also effective.
That's right.
And for many students listening, this might be the first time that you actually are going to an environment where there is more variety than what you're used to. That's, I think, a huge benefit to attending a U.S. college and a huge benefit towards going down that path.
Absolutely.
And there you have it. Lots of tea spilled around how colleges view your academic record and what choices you can make to make yourself more competitive. Hopefully, if you're a younger student or family, you have lots of time to implement our advice. But if you're coming to us as a senior and you don't have a time machine to turn back your courses and grades, stay tuned for our second episode all about intellectual curiosity and how you can share that with colleges through your application. No transcript needed. All right, cheers to you all, much love, and as always, stay curious.